state your full name, please?
Paul Edwin Cole.
What happened to you, Paul?
I don't know.
Hi, my name's Duke Johnson. I'm the director, producer, and writer of the film The Actor, and I'm here at the IndieWire Filmmaker Toolkit podcast to discuss my film.
So I want to start with the origins of this movie. How did you discover the Donald Westlake book? I mean, how did it come to you, and what was it about it that initially you responded to and thought would make a good movie?
Yeah, so I was making a film called Anomalisa with Charlie Kaufman, who is a big hero of mine, and he's a prolific reader. He's read everything. And I just asked him to recommend a couple books that he'd read because I just wanted to expand my literature knowledge. And he had just read this book called Memory by Donald Westlake. And he said, you know, I think he heard about it on NPR or something because it was interesting because it had just recently been published posthumously. It was like found in a drawer or something. It was something he couldn't get published in his lifetime. And they were talking about it and he heard about it and he read it. And he pitched it to me as something that was very interesting to him because it was in the guise of like a noir crime novel, but really it used amnesia, which is sort of like a noir trope. But rather than it being sort of a plot device, it was more like a way to investigate the nature of identity and some more deeper themes. So I thought that was really interesting, and I read the book and I loved it. And I came back to talk to him about it. And it was actually him who was like, you know, you should, if you like it that much, you should try to option it and make it a movie. And I'm like, but it's a Donald Westlake book. Like, what are the chances that option's going to be available? And lo and behold, we found out that it was like available and we optioned it, and the rest is history.
And so what are your first steps in terms of adaptation? Like in terms of figuring out how you're going to translate this book into a screenplay? Where do you start? And who was the co-writer that you wrote the script with? What was the kind of division of labor like between the two of you?
So the way it came about was very organic in that after making Anomalisa and the success that I had with that film, I really kind of wanted to think a lot about what I wanted to do next. I was getting offers and opportunities to do a lot of like sort of mainstream animated films and things like that. I really kind of wasn't sure what kind of story or movie I wanted to make next. So I actually went home to St. Louis, where I'm from, and I started going through like old boxes of my stuff from like high school and, you know, film school and stuff. And I found a letter that I had from a friend of mine that I was at NYU with, who was this kid, Stephen Cooney, who was younger than me. And he was kind of like a wonderkind, kind of really smart kid that I met at NYU. And he opened my mind to a lot of European film that I wasn't familiar with before, like Werner Herzog, and I watched my first Cassavetes film with him and things like that. And it made me think, like, I wonder what this guy's doing. I want to check in on him and see what he's doing. So I contacted him, and he responded that he's living in LA and he had just taken a writing program and he's there to write screenplays. And I was like, oh, we should write a screenplay together. You know, so that started. And then we started trying to figure out what we were going to write. And then the Westlake novel came about. And then in like 2015, we wrote the first draft of the script. And it was really just like a one-to-one book to script kind of thing. And for me, it was like not working as a movie because it was a book in script form. And it was long because, you know, books are longer than scripts. And I wasn't sure what to do with it. So I actually moved on and I wrote another screenplay on my own. And a couple of years went by, and then it was like we were running out of the option. And he, at that time, moved back to New York, and I was still in LA. And then my producing partner, Abigail Spencer, who was sort of keeping up with the option on the book, was like, our option's running out again. Like, you have to do your draft of this script. And then that was the summer. It was early 2019, I think. And I sat down and I did a draft. I spent like 3 months kind of rewriting that script. And then we sent it out, kind of not knowing what was going to happen. And we got some positive responses.
And what was the key to making the script work as a movie as opposed to the book? I mean, it is interesting. Like, I haven't read the book, but I've read a lot of other Westlake. And the movie does feel very different stylistically from how I interpret Westlake. It's more kind of dreamlike and lyrical and poetic and things like that. At what point for you did you figure out the thing that was going to kind of unlock what would make it work as a movie?
Well, it went through several stages. And I ultimately, even once actors started getting involved, I developed it further. But the main thing was that the book is actually all about the main character, Paul Cole's internal monologue. Like, it was all like internal dialogue. And that's really hard to translate to film because it's, you have to see it. You can't just hear what's happening in people's thoughts unless the whole movie was voiceover. So I really started thinking about how do you visualize the experience of somebody with fragmented memory and somebody with a lack of understanding of identity and this sort of like the construct of the environment and is what you see real, what's real, are you real? And like starting to let my imagination run on how to visualize those things and drawing from my experience in animation and kind of world building, which is something that I have done for a long time. And how can I sort of bring myself to it and what I do to the storytelling. And that's really how that came about.
And so you said you were also kind of, the script was changing according to some of the actors you were working with. I mean, were there permutations of this that you went through, before you landed on André Holland and the people you ended up making the movie with? Were there other casting ideas you had, and how did the script kind of metamorphose throughout those?
Early on, we got a lot of positive responses, and it made its way to Ryan Gosling. And I had a couple meetings with Ryan, and he was interested in the project. And so he actually came on board, and I worked with his company at the time, which is his company that he has with Ken Cow, which I'm not sure what it's called now, but it was called Fantascope at the time. And I ended up developing versions of the script with him throughout the entire pandemic. We were kind of like locked in our apartments, and we would just talk on the phone a lot and come up with ideas. And we did sort of like a thriller version of the script. And we did sort of like, we tried like a rom-com version of things, just kind of like Ryan in particular is really passionate about like throwing everything out and trying new things. And like, let's just like, mine all opportunities there. And that was a great process, actually. It was a great learning experience for me and my process as a writer. And by the way, Stephen Cooney was in New York at the time, but we would sort of, sometimes he'd take a scene, sometimes I'd take a scene, and we would share each other's work back and forth and show each other and talk about things. So he was involved throughout that process as well. And then we got to a version of the script pretty close to how it is now, when we took it to Neon. And then things started to become challenging with scheduling and things like that. And we started to have conversations about who's really the right person to play this role and who else could it be. And then once the idea of André Holland came up, we both fell in love with that idea. And then it became about André. And then once André came on board, it was about how does the story change at that point to be his story. And that was kind of the next phase. So it was always kind of ongoing, even through the shooting and the editorial I guess all movies are like that.
Mm-hmm. And so what were your initial conversations like with André Holland?
It was very much like, I'm trying to remember. It was so long ago. I remember what it was like shooting with André. I'm trying to think about the initial conversations. I mean, it was very like, the experience of André, I had met him once before. He knows Abigail, my producing partner, and they had a relationship, and she introduced me to him once a long time ago, and I was a fan from like The Knick and other things. And I met him, and he is such like a charismatic kind of magical, soulful person. I just really liked him right off the bat. And I just had this, just in the back of my mind, I just had this really positive memory of the experience of meeting him. So then when his name was brought up, his name was actually pitched by Neon, on a list of other names. And as soon as that name popped, it was like, oh my God, it just kind of made sense. It was like a magical kind of moment. And we sent him the script, and he just loved it like right away. And our initial conversations were just very positive and effusive of like, And it was like, maybe this needs to change in certain ways. It's 1950s. What does it mean that you're the star now? Yada, yada. And it was very like, we'll figure that out. Let's just kind of like go down this road and see what happens in a very organic way. And that's just really how it happened. And a lot of changes happened while we were shooting. We would just sort of kind of organically be like, this maybe doesn't feel right. Maybe it should have this kind of tonal quality to it. It was very like André, at least with me, the way that we worked together was very kind of spontaneous and in the moment.
How challenging is it to create that kind of environment for yourself and the actors when you're doing a movie that I'm presuming you probably didn't have an enormous budget or schedule? So, if you're working with limited resources, how do you kind of create a world where you and the actors feel that freedom to be kind of organic when the clock is ticking?
If you find out, let me know. It was super challenging because I was just like naively incredibly ambitious. I wanted to build this imaginary town of Jeffords, and I wanted everything to be sets, and I wanted sets to be redressed and reused and duplicated for other sets in the same way that actors are reused and duplicated for other characters, because it's this whole kind of surreal reality of what's real. Have I been here before? This looks familiar. I had these very big ambitions, and it was a very low budget film. And that's why we shot in Budapest. And, we didn't even shoot in a soundstage in Budapest. We shot in a warehouse, like an industrial warehouse, leaky industrial warehouse that I was like sick for the entire time. I had this horrible sinus infection. I was like coughing and ruining takes. It was like, it was really tough. And there was a ticking clock, and I was very ambitious, and I would show up and I had like, 15 setups planned. And by the time we got sets dressed and actors on set and everything ready to go, sometimes it'd be like, how can you get this scene done in an hour? And I'd have to figure out how to like, get it all done in one shot or something like that, which affected pacing and everything else. So it was very challenging in that sense. But the atmosphere that having this sort of troupe of actors created it was almost like a theater mentality, where it was like, I had a very small group of actors that I was working with, and we were kind of all in it together. And the actors, it was established in a way where all the supporting actors had like maybe one or two primary roles, and then they would have one or two almost background or very minor roles. So they were always kind of present at all times, and we were kind of just all doing it together. And it just created an atmosphere of like almost like a film camp, summer camp. Like when I was in high school, and in the summer I'd take film courses, and you just make stuff together with your friends, and it was so that atmosphere was very helpful. And also just André in general is like so pro. Like he's just such an incredible actor that he would just nail it the first take every time. like he would just always do something amazing. And if you did another take, he would do it amazing, but in a different way every single time. So it just saved me. It wasn't like we had to do a million takes. Sometimes I did a million takes for camera things or whatever, but it was like André and the rest of my cast were just so reliable and dependable that it allowed me to get what I needed.
Yeah, I mean, I loved that whole idea of having this troupe of actors who, as you say, are playing multiple parts. And one of the fun things about the movie is the end credits, where you actually realize that some of them even were playing parts you didn't realize they were playing because of the hair and makeup is so elaborate. It's where did that idea come from to essentially have, I don't know, what, a half dozen or so actors playing all the parts in the movie?
Yeah, well, it's sort of like when you make a film, especially when you make an independent film and you're limited with resources, sometimes you have these challenges, and the challenges bring forth great creative ideas. So it was, it first came with like, it's kind of a big cast. There's like kind of a lot of characters, and we don't have a lot of money. I mean, all the actors worked for very little, and it was most favored nations and things like that. And they just wanted to work on the project. And we had to get a lot of our actors from came from London, because we were shooting in Europe and we couldn't afford to travel people from America and, visas and all that sort of stuff. So it was like there were these practical challenges with how we're going to make this film. And then there was the idea of, well, we're trying to build this constructed reality, and this idea of repetition and what I'm seeing is real and what's not real. And the idea came about of this concept of like when you meet somebody, like you're like, have I met? I feel like, because I have that. I meet so many people that I have sort of like this face blindness thing about me already, where I'm like, hey, or I'll see somebody like at an award show or something, and they'll see me and they'll make eye contact with me and they'll nod, and I'm like, hey, and I'm like, I think I know that. I don't know where I know them from. I've seen them before. And there's also this idea too, kind of like, not to get too philosophical or intellectual, but it's like there's these archetypes that you have in your life that you continue to meet, these patterns of people you meet. There's the stern father or the teacher or the unrequited love interest or whatever. And you kind of meet these people in different forms throughout your life. So it became a very, like, once that idea came about, it became very exciting. And by the way, I just love the type of filmmaking that uses kind of, I'm in love with the sort of pageantry and the theatrical qualities of filmmaking. I've always loved, seeing behind the curtain a little bit. And the films that I'm drawn to are not like the gritty realism. It's more like storytelling. And so I liked the quality of actors transforming, and it's called The Actor, and it's showing how actors can just completely transform and play all these. So there were a lot of reasons as soon as that idea sparked that it made sense.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things I loved about the movie right from the beginning, was the theatricality of it. Just really sucked me in, as I loved how everything was so constructed. And I'm curious, in terms of your production designer and cinematographer, how you, with something this specific, how you convey to them what you're looking for in terms of, you talk about how you like to build worlds, and like, this is a great world that you build. Are you somebody who draws stuff out? Do you have visual references or influences that you share with everybody? How do you kind of get everyone on the same page with you creating this world?
Yeah, all of that. First of all, I have some sort of like cinematic techniques that I've developed with my cinematographer, the same cinematographer that shot this, Joe Passarelli, who's shot like 90% of my stop motion and animation work over the years. And he shot my AFI thesis film. Like, we've worked together for 20 some odd years now. And we've developed certain techniques, like in the miniature world and in the stop motion world, that I brought to the live action world, that just sort of is like, it's like my style or our style, So there was that aspect of it, and sharing that with people, because, there's a certain way, particularly coming from animation into live action, there's a certain way that people do things in live action. And it's like, this is how things are done. And that was one of the challenges of the film, actually, which was, Charlie Kaufman told me early on, like, don't let anybody tell you that you have to direct in a certain way. Like, you should have the freedom to direct a movie any way you want to, which was, it sounds like a romantic idea, but it's more difficult than you think, because there's systems in place and structures in place that you have to work within. So that was kind of challenging. But in terms of my creative department heads, my production designer and my cinematographer, they got it very early on. I made a lookbook that was very detailed. It had music, it had reference images, it had animation in it, it had all this. It was kind of like a tonal reference of the emotional targets and the visual targets that I was aiming for. And then I did some animatic work, which I drew from my animation experience, which allows me to illustrate exactly what the shots I'm planning to do are. And then from that, I can draw diagrams of exactly what I need the sets to be. And then conversations happen with the production designer about, and with the line producer, about how this can be practical. Like, how can you build a whole city and then all these sets? It's very complicated. But if the city is like a city street, and then what's in those doors are people's apartments and all the sets, you only have to build that wall and then the other walls. It was very, like, a lot of technical issues like that were solved through creative means, which I liked, because I really liked the idea of things doubling as other things. Like, his hotel room is the same as the doctor's office, is the same as both doctors' office. It's like the sets are reused quite a bit intentionally. But also that served a practical purpose as well.
When you were starting out, was your goal to be an animator? Was it to be a live action director? Was it both? Was it kind of circumstance that led you on the path you're on? Because I feel like you're very good at both.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it's so funny how life works. It's a lot of it is like luck and fate. And I pursued live action purely. And I went to film school at NYU and I studied live action, but I took an animation course while I was there. And I remember I studied abroad at FAMU in Prague, which is a school that's very well known for animation and particularly stop motion. And I remember seeing those sets and kind of like falling in love with that idea a little bit, but kind of putting it in the back of my mind. And then I went to AFI and I made live action. I studied live action film and I made a live action short. And then I invited a friend of mine that I'd known for many years who had an Adult Swim animated show called Moral Oral, a stop motion show. And he saw the short and he was like, oh, I see you can direct. Like, do you want to direct an episode of my TV show? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, well, it's in its second season. If it gets a third season, you can direct an episode. So it was about a year and a half between the second season and the third season when I could direct an episode. And I hung around the studio and I kind of learned the craft a little bit, but I soon discovered that, oh, this is something I've always loved. You know, I loved stop motion and animation my whole life. And I just was, as I thought of filmmaking and I was very, I was into like, foreign cinema and European cinema throughout high school and like, college, that it was like, it just seemed like that was the path. But then ultimately the marriage of the two worlds became the thing that I wanted to do. So then I spent, 15 years or so working in animation. And then when I had the opportunity to do the Charlie Kaufman film and do Anomalisa is very much like a kind of a standard live action cinematic approach to filmmaking, but done with puppets. And then now this is live action, and the project I'm doing next is sort of a hybrid of the two. So yeah, it just kind of happened organically. Like it feels like it was always meant to be, but I just kind of lucked into it in a way.
So, the tone of the movie, you mentioned that with Gosling, you were, kind of had different versions of it. And I'm curious how the tone evolved in the editing room, because I feel like this is a movie that could go a lot of different ways.
Yes.
How did you find the tone in the editing room, and were there different permutations that you played around with?
Once we saw kind of what we had, first of all, as I had mentioned earlier, it was a challenging production. We were limited with resources and time, and I was very ambitious in what I was trying to get, and it created challenges that, I didn't get as much coverage and, technical things like that I'd hoped for. So when we came back and we started putting the edit together, it felt like there were holes or things missing. But I have a studio in America that an animation studio, called Starburns Industries that I was working in, and I was editing there. And I had stages. We've since moved to smaller offices or whatever, but I had stages at the time, and I thought, well, I'll maybe be able to get like one pickup day. What could I do with that pickup day? And what could I do without a pickup day just on my own, And we felt the desire to kind of lean into the artifice of the movie even more and the surreal qualities. And I was able to do things like reach out to a friend of mine who's an incredible painter. His name's Casey Bao, and he did some matte paintings for me. And then I had some friends, build some miniature sets, and I went down there and animated some stuff on my own and did some animation. And then it started to sort of take shape in the sort of more surreal qualities, which I liked, and I thought made the film unique in the right kind of way. And so we started to lean in that direction. So it is very much, the old adage of like, you make the film 3 times or something. And the film that I shot is not ultimately the film that it is now. I hope for the better.
And what role does music and sound design play in terms of finding the right tone?
I mean, everything, music is so hard because, there's this like Quentin Tarantino quote. I'm not going to get it exactly right, but he was like, it was something when he was doing, what's the movie he did right after Pulp Fiction?
Jackie Brown?
Jackie Brown. He did Jackie Brown. He did it with no music. It had no music. And then they watched it and they were like, oh shit, this needs music. And he's like, well, I'm not going to like turn over the entire emotional core of my film to a composer, like right at the end, so they ended up licensing all this like previously existing score, which was a really smart kind of idea. But that always, that concept of like, I'm not just going to turn the emotional core of my film over to like one person, because it's so true. Like the music is like, it's the combination of music and images really that is the emotion of what you're doing so much of the time. So that is to say that it was a challenge to find the right person. And then once I met Richard Reed Parry, and he seemed to really get it, and we spent a long time. He wrote so much different ideas. I love the way he works, because he just writes tons of ideas. And then I'm like, well, there's something interesting there. That's kind of spooky. He's not even thinking about where it would fit in the movie. It's sort of like he watches the movie, and then he's like, it sparks ideas, and he doesn't know where the music's going to go. And he's just starting to write kind of cues. And then you lock into something and then find where it's going to go. And it was a fun way to work. And I'm really happy with the music. I think the music's really beautiful, and I think he did a really great job. And it was also, I wanted to do something. I love that sort of era. The 1950s and 60s are kind of like my favorite era of cinema, and the music is very, very bold. Like nowadays, a lot of score is like almost subtle and withholding from really going into the emotion. And I wanted to just kind of go big and go there, use big orchestral type things and stuff. Again, limited budget, so it was cool. Like I think we had one day with an orchestra, and then he has his group of talented artists, and he plays like every instrument himself and was able to do a lot of stuff. And so it was cool.
Well, I guess to wrap things up, I'm just curious, this being your first live action feature, what were the biggest surprises for you, whether positive or negative? And what do you think you learned that you'll take forward on the next one?
I'll tell you, I was like, I'm not going to do another stop motion movie because they're too hard. And then I did a live action movie, and they're so hard because you have no time. It's this ticking clock. And if something goes wrong, if anything, you have a location, or you have a set, and you have a certain number of days. It's all about the days you have. You hear Fincher talk about it a lot. It's like you spend all this money and you get all these people and you build all these things and you do all this stuff, and then it's like you do one take and you move on. No, he's going to want to do 50 takes. Well, of course. But then if you're making an independent film, or you don't have the time to do that, and you're so limited, and you're trying to do something ambitious where you have lots of locations, we have New York and Ohio, and you go all over the place and all these different sets, it's really, really challenging. And sometimes things aren't working, and you have to stop and you have to figure it out, and you collaborate with your team and your coworkers and your actors, and how can we make this better? How can we plus this? How can we get this? And sometimes there's just like not enough time to do that. So the ticking clock is crazy. And I also come from, a kind of a, what's the word? Pretentious film school kind of background, where it's like, coverage is for losers or something, like not for artists, so there's I think another Fincher quote is like, there's two ways to shoot a scene and one of them is wrong or something, right? Mm-hmm. And I would just say, get some fucking coverage. like you need stuff, especially to control pacing, as we talked about. You need stuff to cut to in the editing room, and so nowadays, especially if you shoot digitally, I mean, you guys have two cameras right now. It's like, it's so easy to just throw in another camera. And especially, if you can get two cameras on something, then you're covering like one take. So you don't have to think about continuity and stuff like that. And you just have something to cut to if you want to adjust the pacing. So that helps a lot. Thinking about it from that perspective. And just, even if the shot you want to get, and it's this one shot and it's a oneer, cover it with something if you can.
Well, thanks for coming and doing this, Duke. This has been great.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.